Michael Jackson heard 14-year-old playing piano in church basement, gave him sheet music that made him famous. The security guard at First Baptist Church in South Central Los Angeles had been hearing the music for 3 weeks straight. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, around 7:30 p.m. after the choir practice ended and the building went quiet, someone was playing the basement piano. Beautiful, complex melodies that echoed through the empty hallways. It was April 1987. Michael Jackson was at the absolute peak of his fame. Bad had just been released 2 months earlier, and he was preparing for what would become the largest grossing tour in history. But on this particular Thursday night, April 16th, Michael wasn't in a recording studio or a sold-out arena. He was walking through the parking lot of a church in South Central, looking for the source of music that shouldn't have been there. The church's pastor, Reverend Thomas Clayton, had called Michael's manager 3 days earlier. There was a kid, 14 years old, playing jazz arrangements of Beethoven sonatas in the church basement after hours. The janitor had reported it. The Reverend had gone down to listen. What he heard made him pick up the phone and make a call he knew was probably pointless, but felt necessary anyway. Marcus Webb was the kid's name. He lived 4 blocks from the church with his grandmother in a 2-bedroom apartment that housed 6 people. His mother worked double shifts at County Hospital. Marcus had been playing piano since he was 7, taught initially by his grandmother who had studied music in college. When she could no longer teach him anything new, Marcus taught himself. The church basement piano was a 1964 Steinway upright, out of tune, several keys stuck occasionally, and the bench wobbled, but it was the only piano Marcus had regular access to, and he treated it like it was Carnegie Hall's Steinway Concert Grand. Tuesday and Thursday evenings were his time. The janitor, William Hayes, had discovered Marcus the first week and instead of kicking him out, gave him a key to the basement entrance. The only rule was that Marcus had to be gone by 9 p.m. For 6 months, this had been Marcus's sanctuary. 2 hours, twice a week, teaching himself arrangements that most conservatory students struggled with. He worked from library books, from sheet music his grandmother had saved, from recordings he listened to on a cassette player he'd bought at a yard sale for $3. What Marcus didn't know was that William Hayes had been talking about him. To the Reverend, to the choir director, to anyone who would listen. "This kid is special," William kept saying. "Someone needs to hear him. Someone needs to do something." Reverend Clayton had listened for himself one Thursday in early April. He'd walked down to the basement quietly, stood outside the door, and heard Marcus working through a piece that the Reverend later identified as Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, arranged for solo piano, played with a maturity and emotional depth that shouldn't have been possible from a 14-year-old who had never had formal training beyond his grandmother's lessons. The Reverend made the call that weekend. Michael Jackson's manager, Frank DiLeo, listened with patient tolerance. Talented kid, church basement, would Michael be willing to stop by? DiLeo wrote down the information, fully intending to file it away and forget about it. But something made him mention it to Michael 2 days later. Maybe it was the specificity of the details. Michael asked for the address. Thursday, April 16th, 7:43 p.m. Michael Jackson walked through the basement entrance of First Baptist Church and stood in the doorway of a room that smelled like old books and floor polish. Marcus Webb was at the piano, completely absorbed. He didn't hear the door open. He didn't notice someone standing 15 feet behind him. His hands moved across the keys with focused intensity that erased everything else. Michael recognized the piece immediately. Clair de Lune, Debussy's masterpiece. But Marcus wasn't playing it the way it was written. He was interpreting it, adding jazz harmonies, changing the rhythm in places, making it something that honored the original while becoming entirely his own. The technical execution was impressive. The emotional maturity was stunning. Michael stood perfectly still for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, the length of time it took Marcus to complete the piece. When the last note faded, Michael didn't move. He waited to see what Marcus would do next. Marcus sat at the piano for a long moment, his hands still resting on the keys. Then he reached for a worn spiral notebook on top of the piano, flipped it open, and wrote something down. Michael could see from where he stood that the notebook was filled with handwritten musical notation, arrangements, ideas, the private documentation of a young composer working in complete isolation. Then Marcus began to play again. This time it was an original composition, something he'd been working on for 3 months. A piece that combined classical structure with rhythms he'd absorbed from the R&B and funk that played constantly in his neighborhood. It was ambitious, occasionally rough, but undeniably brilliant. Michael waited until Marcus finished the piece and reached for his notebook again. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the small basement room. The notebook fell from Marcus's hands. He spun around on the piano bench so fast he almost fell off. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened, and for several seconds he couldn't form words. Michael walked forward slowly, his hands visible, his expression calm and friendly. He introduced himself, which was completely unnecessary but somehow made the moment feel less surreal. He asked Marcus if he could sit down. Marcus nodded, still unable to speak. What happened in the next 45 minutes would determine the trajectory of Marcus Webb's entire life, but neither of them knew that yet. Michael asked questions. How long have you been playing? Who taught you? Where did you learn that Rachmaninoff arrangement? Do you write your own music? Have you ever performed for anyone? Marcus answered in fragments, his voice shaky at first, but growing steadier as the conversation continued. He explained about his grandmother, about teaching himself from library books, about the 2 hours twice a week in this basement being the only time he had access to a piano. He talked about the music he heard in his head, the arrangements he wanted to try, the compositions he was working on, but had no way to hear performed by actual musicians. Michael listened with the focused attention of someone who recognized exactly what he was witnessing. This wasn't just talent, this was the kind of raw, undeniable gift that appears maybe once in a generation, usually in places where nobody's looking for it. Then Michael asked the question that mattered most. If you could study music seriously, if you had access to real training, real instruments, real opportunities, what would you want to learn? Marcus's answer came immediately, no hesitation, everything. Composition, arrangement, orchestration, conducting. He wanted to understand how music worked at every level, how to take what he heard in his head and translate it into something other people could perform. He wanted to write film scores, symphonies, jazz arrangements, everything. Michael nodded slowly. Then he asked Marcus to play something else. Anything he wanted. Marcus chose a piece he'd been working on for 2 weeks, an arrangement of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue condensed for solo piano, with his own interpretive additions woven throughout. As Marcus played, Michael pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and wrote something down. When Marcus finished, Michael stood up, walked to the piano, and placed the notebook page on top of Marcus's spiral notebook. Then he did something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Michael sat down next to Marcus on the wobbly piano bench and played the opening phrase of a melody Marcus had never heard before. It was beautiful, complex, the kind of melodic line that stays in your mind for days. Michael played it twice, then looked at Marcus and asked him what he heard. For the next 20 minutes, they sat together at the out-of-tune church basement piano, building a musical arrangement in real time. Michael would play a phrase, Marcus would add harmonies, Michael would suggest a variation, Marcus would develop it further. Two musicians separated by age and fame and circumstance, but connected by the only thing that actually mattered. When they finished, Michael looked at his watch and realized he'd been in the basement for almost an hour. He stood up and told Marcus 3 things. First, he was arranging a full scholarship to the Colburn School, one of the most prestigious music conservatories in Los Angeles. Michael would personally fund it. Second, he was having a Yamaha Baby Grand delivered to Marcus's apartment so Marcus would never again have to sneak into church basements to practice. Third, Michael wanted Marcus to arrange a piece for the Bad Tour, something that combined classical and contemporary. If the arrangement was as good as Michael believed it would be performed in front of millions of people on the biggest tour in music history. Marcus couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out several pages of handwritten sheet music, a piece he'd been working on but hadn't figured out how to arrange properly. He handed it to Marcus and told him to take his time, to be honest with the music. Then Michael wrote something on the last page. A phone number, a direct line. He told Marcus to call when the arrangement was ready. They shook hands. Michael walked to the door, then turned back one more time. He told Marcus that what he'd heard wasn't potential or promise. It was already exceptional. The training would make it more powerful, but the gift was already there, fully formed. Then Michael Jackson walked out of the church basement and drove away into a Thursday night in South Central Los Angeles. Marcus sat at the piano for another 30 minutes, staring at the sheet music Michael had given him, reading the handwritten notes and annotations, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, he carefully placed the music in his notebook, locked the basement door behind him, and walked home through streets that looked exactly the same as they had 2 hours earlier, but somehow felt completely different. The piano arrived 6 days later. Not a Yamaha Baby Grand, but a Steinway Model M, the same piano used in professional recording studios around the world. It barely fit in the apartment. Marcus's grandmother cried when she saw it. The scholarship to Colburn was confirmed 2 weeks after that. Marcus auditioned on a Saturday morning in May, performing 3 pieces, including his Gershwin arrangement. He was accepted immediately with a full scholarship funded by an anonymous donor that everyone involved knew was Michael Jackson. The arrangement Michael had requested took Marcus 6 weeks to complete. He worked on it every day, sometimes for hours, refining, revising, making sure every note served the emotional core of the piece. When he finally called the number Michael had written on the sheet music, the phone was answered on the second ring. Michael listened to Marcus describe the arrangement over the phone, asked detailed questions about specific sections, then invited Marcus to the studio where the bad tour arrangements were being rehearsed. Marcus, 14 years old, walked into a professional recording studio for the first time in his life and heard his arrangement performed by world-class musicians. The piece was added to the Bad Tour set list 3 weeks later. It was performed 123 times over the next 16 months in front of an estimated 4.4 million people across 15 countries. The program credits listed the arrangement as Classical Interlude, arranged by Marcus Webb. That program credit changed everything. Music directors saw the name. Conservatory professors noticed. Opportunities that would have taken decades to earn through traditional paths appeared almost immediately, not because of Michael Jackson's fame, but because the arrangement itself was undeniably brilliant. Marcus Webb graduated from Colburn at 18, top of his class. He chose Juilliard for advanced study, where he studied composition and orchestration under some of the most respected teachers in the world. By 25, Marcus had composed scores for 3 independent films. By 30, he'd arranged music for artists across genres. By 35, he'd won his first Grammy for Best Arrangement, Instrumental or A Cappella. But the most important piece Marcus Webb ever composed came in 2009, 2 months after Michael Jackson died. It was a 20-minute orchestral work titled Thursday Evening, April 16, 1987. It premiered at Disney Hall in Los Angeles, performed by the LA Philharmonic. The piece began with a solo piano playing the opening phrases of the melody Michael had played that night in the church basement. Gradually, the orchestra joined in, building and developing the themes Marcus and Michael had created together, transforming that improvised collaboration into a fully realized orchestral composition. In the audience that night was Reverend Thomas Clayton, William Hayes the janitor, Marcus's grandmother, and 3 current students from Colburn School, all recipients of the Marcus Webb Scholarship for Underprivileged Youth. After the performance, Marcus addressed the audience. He talked about that Thursday night in 1987, about turning around and seeing someone who had chosen to be there, in a church basement in South Central, listening. He talked about the lesson that mattered most. Talent exists everywhere. In church basements, community centers, apartments where 6 people share 2 bedrooms, the only thing that separates the kids who make it from the kids who don't isn't ability, it's access. Backstage after the performance, Marcus opened his notebook to the sheet music from 1987. Below the phone number Michael had written was a message Marcus had never shared publicly. Music doesn't belong to the people who can afford lessons. It belongs to the people who can't stop hearing it. Keep listening. Keep writing. The world needs what you're hearing. MJ. Marcus had read those words thousands of times over the years, before auditions, before performances, through every moment when being a black kid from South Central trying to make it in classical music felt impossible. Because there was always a next project, always another kid practicing in a church basement somewhere, hearing music nobody else could hear yet, waiting for someone to open the door and listen. Marcus Webb built a career on making sure those doors stayed open, and every time he funded another scholarship or mentored another young composer or insisted that auditions be blind to names and zip codes and everything except the music itself, he was honoring the lesson learned on a Thursday evening in April 1987. The security guard at First Baptist Church had been hearing the music for 3 weeks. Michael Jackson heard it once. That was all it took.